Okay, welcome. It is just afternoon, so I will go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about the Secretary of the Interior Standards. So thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Abigail Chrisman, Senior City Planner with Landmark Preservation. So just some basics today. Participating in the webinar, everyone's welcome. If you have any questions at the end, we're happy to answer questions live. You can also type questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and I will then get to those at the end. So if you think of anything while I'm talking, feel free to add those in. Be respectful, and we will post this online. So this will be a resource that you can get to rewatch or refer others to anytime you want in the future. Okay, so let's get started. So what are the Secretary of the Interior standards? So there's standards that are for the treatment of historic properties. So put together by the Secretary of the Interior with the National Park Service, who's kind of the guiding federal agency for historic preservation in the US. So these standards establish our historic preservation principles and really establish best practices nationally. And they were designed to provide a framework for maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic building materials, as well as also applying to new additions, alterations, changes to the surrounding building site. So there are 4 sets of standards. So when we talk about the standards, that can be the preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, or reconstruction standard. Which standard you choose for a particular project really depends on kind of what's most applicable and relevant to that building. So that is based on its level of significance. Is it an extremely significant national landmark, or is it just a building that's in a historic district? Also will depend on its existing condition and the historical records that are available. So with something like a reconstruction, generally, we're not going to do many reconstructions, but that could be used for a highly significant building, perhaps destroyed by fire or some other natural disaster, and we have really meticulous historic records. So it would be possible to rebuild it to match what was there originally. So in that case, reconstruction would be appropriate. Restoration. So you see in the image there, example is a Frank Lloyd Wright building. So again, something that has a very high level of significance. And so in that case, if it had had a lot of alterations over the year, because it's a work of a real master architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, it could be appropriate to take it back and restore it to its original condition after Wright built it. Then we also have preservation, which is just maintaining the historic building. Pretty much, it's just keeping those key materials, keeping it in its original use, keeping, not making any significant changes, and just preserving the building. And that's what you'd see the majority of house museums, major kind of public historic buildings. Just preservation is going to be the key. But then we have rehabilitation. And that's where you get more flexibility, and that's about either allowing a building to change uses, or also just updating it to really modernize it, and make it more habitable, up to modern heating, ventilation, electrical, all those things that so that's kind of the most flexible. And all of these standards can be applied to historic properties of all types, materials, sizes, and use. So as I said, it's just going to kind of depend what the building is, which of these 4 standards may be the most appropriate. And the Secretary of Interior standards apply to the entire building. So they apply to the exterior as well as the interior, and they apply to the site and any associated new construction. So today our focus is on the standards for rehab. So what exactly do we mean when we say rehab? So rehabilitation, process of returning a property to a state of utility through repair or alteration, which makes possible an efficient contemporary use, while preserving those portions and features of the property which are significant to its historic, architectural, and cultural values. So both part of those are really key, that we wanted buildings to have a contemporary use. We want, we don't want to just, rehab isn't about maintaining museum quality buildings. It's about just having everyday historic buildings that are actively used, that are active homes, offices, other spaces that we use and are, well equipped. But we want to make sure that with that contemporary use, we still are maintaining those key significant features that are historic, architectural, and cultural. So the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehab are the ones that are used most often because they are the most flexible and really allow for new uses. They're also used a lot because they're the guidelines that provide regulatory guidance for the federal and state tax credit programs, as well as for various grant programs and historic preservation easements. The goal really of the rehab standards: ensure that essential character of historic buildings is retained during any renovation projects. So, how do the standards relate to Denver landmark preservation? So you may wonder, why am I here as a landmark planner talking about these federal guidelines? How does it relate to landmark? So a little bit about the standards for rehab versus our local Denver design guidelines. So the standards for rehab, they really establish our national preservation philosophy. They provide a basis for local design guidelines. So most communities across the US that have local guidelines, these are based on those kind of overarching principles that are established by the standards for rehabilitation. They provide kind of broad conceptual guidance, as you will see. So there's just 10 standards, and I will go through those next. So you'll see it's a pretty broad guidance. They are used for the review of all Colorado state tax credit applications, residential and commercial. So this is one of the ways that they really intersect with Denver landmark preservation. If you are applying to Denver for a residential tax credit, it is the standards for rehabilitation we will use to review your tax credit, not our own Denver design guidelines. So, and that way we use these very frequently. They're really important to our work at Landmark as well, since they provide, they're the review criteria for tax credit projects. And these standards do apply to the exterior and the interior. So that means if we are reviewing your tax credit project, we are looking at both the exterior and the interior. And they apply to the entire project. So if you are rehabbing the interior of your home, doing some restoration work, and also building an addition, the whole project would have to meet the standards. It's not just does the work we are doing to restore the fireplace work, but does everything we were doing on the entire project, does the addition and all the other work all meet the standards. So the standards are really kind of a much more holistic. It's looking at the entire project, not just how are you treating a particular element. So Denver's design guidelines, they are based on the standards. And any future updates, as some of you may know, we are currently working on some updates to our guidelines. Those will still need to meet the standards. That's still going to be the original basis for our guidelines. So it's always, kind of important to understand those and refer back to those, because that's the basis for our design guidelines and will continue to be the basis moving forward. But with our local design guidelines, we can really adapt the standards to local conditions in Denver, and we can provide a lot more specific guidance and examples. So to kind of make the what can be somewhat broad, subjective of the Secretary of standards, we try to make it clearer, more explicit of how exactly we are interpreting those guidelines in Denver. And Denver's design guidelines are used for all design review of individual landmarks and review within historic districts. And our design guidelines apply only to exterior work. So if you are applying to a landmark For design review, we're only going to look at the exterior. If you're applying for a tax credit, we're using the standards, and then we're going to look at the exterior and the interior. Hope that helps us a little bit to kind of set up how these two things interact, how the standards for rehab and our design guidelines interact with each other. And now we will jump into the standards. So as I said, there are 10 standards that really provide these overarching guidance for how we treat historic properties in the US. So number 1, basically choose an appropriate use. So standard number 1 says a property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So Union Station is a great example of that. Train station, which is still a train station, but also has added a lot of new uses added, new hotel and restaurant spaces as well. But the key features of Union Station have been retained. Still the key exterior features, but also that key central atrium area has been retained. So you still can really go in and get a sense of kind of, the historic volumes and spaces and all the original decoration and style of the original train station. So some examples, another project that would be considered to meet this standard is the Ferry building in San Francisco. So converted from a ferry terminal into a food market. So you can see here on the exterior, really all those key features have been retained. And then you see there on the interior, you still get that big interior volume. They've added new market spaces, but you still get a sense of the interior spaces that were there historically. So you still has that large interior volume. Something that would not meet the standard. So here you see the Michigan Theater, which was converted into a parking garage. So this would be an alteration that very much does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards because it's really significantly altering the historic character. You've removed a lot of historic features, and the building just at all, that interior does not read the same way at all as a parking garage as it did when it was a historic theater. Okay, so on to standard number 2. Basically retain the historic character. So standard 2 says historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So here you see an example of a restoration project, a rehab that would be considered to meet this standard. So you can see over the years, definitely some alterations have occurred to this building, particularly at the storefront, but it does still retain a lot of its original features. It still has its original cornice. It still has the original window openings and some of the original hood detail on the windows. It also still has a kind of a decorative detail there above the storefront. So you can see when they did the work, all those key original features have been retained and restored. The cornice has been restored, all that kept those original window openings, kept the key features that were there, and then they reopened and put on a new storefront that references, it's a simple storefront, but that looks like it would reference what would likely have been there originally. So they kept everything, that was still present and kept that character with, then also restoring items of the building that had been significantly altered over time. So some alterations that we consider to not meet this standard. Things like only saving the facade. So the facade is not the entire building. There's a lot more to a building than its facade. It's its whole shape and mass and roof form and interior spaces and volumes and finishes. So anytime you're talking about just saving the facade and, demolishing or gutting the rest of the building, that would definitely not meet standard number 2. So standard number 3, ensure that a building tells the true story of its development. So complete standard says, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. This is one that I find often kind of trips people up a little bit more, that is a little bit more difficult to understand. So if you look at this example here, you have a building, looks like probably done in the 60s or 70s, kind of a 60s version of a colonial revival. And then you have that same building after it has gone through a renovation project. A renovation project that basically tried to make it look more historic. They added some dormers, they added a new front porch, they worked on the trim. So in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people would look at this and say, well, wow, it looks a lot better after. If in a historic neighborhood, great. This is going to be much more compatible with a historic neighborhood because this house now looks more historic. But that's a fake historic or a false historic. This is not what the property looked like originally. So trying to give a property a historic appearance that it never had originally, even if attractive, it does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, because properties should tell their true story of development. And this is because, the goal is historic preservation, not aesthetic preservation. So it's not about trying to, create historic districts where everything is aesthetically unified, where, if elements are missing, you just kind of imagine what would have been there, that if you're building infill, you just want it to replicate what was there historically, because that's a false sense of history. So I really like this quote from Ada Louise Huxtable, an architectural critic. It says, "What the perfect fake or impeccable restoration lacks are the hallmarks of time and place. They deny imperfections, alterations, and accommodations. They wipe out all the incidents of life and change. There is nothing left of the journey from there to here, nothing that palpably joins the past to the present, that makes direct physical and emotional contact with the viewer, the bittersweet link with those who have been there before." So another example of applying this, you can see in this excerpt from our Denver design guidelines, place where you can see very strongly that influence of the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehab. So this is our guidance for what to do if you have a commercial building that has been altered. So you see here our example on the left. Here's a commercial building. Still has its original windows, but the cornice has been removed and the storefront has really been significantly altered. So somebody wants to fix up, rehab that building. Well, what's appropriate? What should they do? So we really outline that there are 3 choices moving forward. So if they have historical documentation, so if there are drawings of the original building, if there are good historic photographs of what that building looked like originally, then they could do an accurate reconstruction and kind of go back to basically use a different standard than the standards for rehab, and instead they could use that reconstruction standard. And if you have sufficient documentation, you could rebuild it, basically, or redo that storefront, rebuild the cornice to look like it did originally. Because if you have that historical documentation and you know exactly what it looked like originally, then you're not going to be creating a false sense of history, as long as that's clear. You could also do a simplified historic interpretation. So if you don't know exactly what it looked like, you could look at other nearby commercial buildings, think about kind of what the key features are, and do something that's just simple. You're not being overly ornate because you don't know exactly what that was, and you don't want to create a false sense of history that the building was more ornate than it was historically. But you could do a simplified version, or you could do a contemporary interpretation. So something that's clear that it's modern, but that is still compatible with the historic building. So on to standard number 4. So basically consider historic changes as potentially significant. So most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So this is the Mint Bar in Wyoming. Really awesome little bar. You can see here, looks like originally was a early 20th century one-part block commercial building. And then it had some significant alterations at mid-century. Mid 20th century was when Wyoming was starting to get a lot of tourism centered on Western history, interest in the West, dude ranches, cowboys. So it got a log facade added to the building here, as well as a really awesome neon light. And it would be really significantly altering and removing a key part of the history of this building if you just wanted to restore it to its original appearance. Because now those other elements that have been added have really acquired their own significance. So based on the standards would say if you wanted to rehab this building, you need to also rehab that, log storefront. You need to rehab that sign, and you need to rehab, all of those features that have been added that are considered to have acquired significance. So you shouldn't just remove those to take it back to an earlier time. So some examples of some buildings here in Denver, of ones that have acquired significance. So such as Dora Moore, so built in the late 19th century, but has a gymnasium and other additions added in the early 20th century. And those are now part of the history of the school as well. So it would not be appropriate to remove those additions. We also have Denver Athletic Club. We have the Tivoli, buildings that have evolved over time and that have additions that have acquired their own significance. So another example here of an alteration that has acquired significance. So one from Leavenworth, Washington. So you see here the original downtown appearance on the left. And then in the 1960s, Leavenworth was looking for a way to revitalize their economy. And they wanted to create what had been a logging town and make it into a tourist destination. And so they kind of recreated their whole downtown with a Bavarian appearance and really very thoughtfully studied Bavarian architecture and tried to create a little Bavaria in the mountains in Washington state. And this is now, this was done in the 60s. So, it's now more than 50 years old, and these, new storefronts have really acquired their own significance. They tell their own story of the history and evolution of the economy of Leavenworth, Washington. So it would not meet the standards to try to take them back to that original appearance, because you'd be losing a key part of history. Same can often be said with a lot of mid-century facades. Now sometimes it's debate: do we keep the mid-century? Do we remove it? But a lot of mid-century facades, particularly ones that really, kind of have a thoughtful, unique design, those have their own significance. They really tell us something about the evolution of mid-century style and what was popular there, and efforts of small towns often to compete with bigger cities and wanting to update and modernize. So really a lot of mid-century facades can tell us a key part of both design history as well as commercial history. There's also alterations that have cultural significance. So, for example, the Italian market area in Philadelphia has a lot of cultural significance for these buildings. And so, it wouldn't be appropriate to come in and just kind of remove all the, additional alterations. You really have to think about what are, really kind of key to the culture of the neighborhood and the culture of how it's evolved and how it's evolved with the food markets there and the local food culture. But these are some alterations that would create a false sense of history. So you see here on the left, they decided to add a new porch, very historical in appearance, kind of craftsman style, added, additional kind of craftsman detailing, but there's no evidence that the house had these features originally. So without documentation that those were original features, that's really creating a false sense of history, making a house, particularly possibly look more ornate or give it a sense of style that it never had originally. And then on the right, you see an example of two separate buildings that were combined together. So also not appropriate. That would also be considered to be creating a false sense of history. But here's a case of some alterations. Obviously, this building on the left here has been significantly altered, but I don't think there's anything particularly unique about those alterations. Just looks like a lot of trim was removed. Probably somebody just didn't want to deal with it when they were replacing the siding, something that often happens, didn't want to deal with the upkeep. And because you have an adjacent house that shows you pretty much exactly what that house did look like originally, in this case, it's one that I think, those alterations probably have not gained significance, and that you could probably reverse them because you have the adjacent house as a model. Good example of showing probably pretty much what the house on the left originally looked like. So standard number 5, basically retain the character defining features. So distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques that characterize a property shall be preserved. So these can be exterior features, interior features, since the standards do apply to both interiors and exteriors. And it's really anything that characterizes the property. So I realize that's kind of broad. So here's an example, so what contributes to historic character? And it can be the shape, the site, the structure, the space, the craftsmanship, the details, the materials, the scale, the size. So really it's any prominent or distinctive aspect, quality, or characteristic that contributes to its visual character. And these characteristics also convey the period of construction and the historic use. So it's anything that helps you identify how the building was used and when it was constructed, and potentially how it changed over time. So each architectural style tends to have its own character defining features. So these are all features here that if you see them, you're like, okay, it's an Art Deco building. So there's often kind of collections of features that really identify both the time period. You look at these, and you're like, okay, it's 1920s, it's 1930s, or that help you identify what style it was constructed in. But simple features can really be just as important to character as ornate ones. So if you look here, a simple staircase versus a really ornate one, both are really key to the character of those properties. A really more decorative interior archway and just simple archways. Either way, both are really key to the particular characteristics of those properties. So just because something is simple doesn't mean that those features don't contribute to its character. It doesn't have to be ornate and fancy to be character defining. Okay, then the next one that is probably one of the ones other standard that people struggle with the most, repair rather than replace. So standard 6 says, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. So several key things here. Basically, if you can repair it, repair it. Don't replace if you don't have to. As you see, like on the siding here, only some of the boards are deteriorated beyond repair. So only replace the boards that need repair. Don't, because you have some boards that are deteriorated, decide that you need to reside the entire building. So look to see what can be repaired and look to see what should be selectively replaced. And when you do have to replace, match. So see here, same thing with the siding, it's matching the adjacent siding. So you see this in Denver with Denver Landmarks with our window policy, which basically is why we ask for window evaluations. If you want to replace historic windows, we require detailed photos of the condition of the windows and a professional window evaluation to see whether or not they could be, repaired. If they can't be repaired, then we just require that your replacement windows match those originals as closely as possible. But it's why there is that extra step in the process. It's because of the standards for rehab that say that you should always check first to see if something can be repaired before it's replaced. So avoid destructive treatments. So standard 7, chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So just really about being careful with the products you use on historic materials. A lot of materials, particularly things like brick and sandstone, are fragile and are old. And if treated too harshly with either chemicals that are not appropriate or harsh methods such as sandblasting, you can seriously damage the materials. So it's just about making sure that the treatments that you use are appropriate. So this is one of those things, like this doesn't really come up in our design guidelines because maintenance of historic buildings is not something you have to come to Landmark for review. We review alterations to the exterior, but we don't review general maintenance. So, if you're going to be cleaning your masonry building, that's not something that you need to come to Landmark for review. But if as part of a tax credit project, you are removing paint or stucco from a historic building, then that is something that you could get a tax credit for, but we would have to review all the treatment methods you plan to use. And if you were using a treatment method that did not meet the standards, then your project would not qualify for a tax credit. So some examples here of cleaning work that meets the standards, work that was very carefully done here to preserve the original terracotta and stone and not damage any of the surfaces. Whereas here you see what can happen. Sandblasting brick or using high pressure cleaning methods too close to the brick, you can it will totally remove kind of the protective surface. So you get this really pockmarked brick that then is very fragile and will deteriorate rapidly. So standard 8, protect archaeological resources. So standard 8 says significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. This is something we don't really deal with in Denver Landmarks. We don't designate archaeological resources, and this isn't something we have review over. But certainly if you're doing other work that has historic preservation grant funding or other work involved, other funding involved, then this is a standard you would need to follow to make sure that if you're doing excavation work, it's being monitored and making sure that any archaeological resources are being identified by professional archaeologists and recorded and mitigated. Okay, so next up, getting close to the end, design additions to be sympathetic to the original. So standard number 9, new additions shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So here you have some examples from our design guidelines. So you have on the left examples of additions that would meet our guidelines. These are also all additions that would meet the standards. And ones on the right, additions that would not. So the additions that are going to be compatible, they're going to be located to the rear, because on the rear, generally not going to have as many character defining features. So if you attach something to the rear, you're generally not is likely to be really impacting any character defining features. And you're going to be making sure that the original structure maintains its visual prominence. You want to be compatible with the massing size and scale. Again, so you don't want it to be, overwhelm the original property. So additions that are much larger or located on the roof and really, would change how the property is perceived. Those are going to be incompatible with the standards and not sympathetic. So some example of additions that meet the standards. So we have here a rear addition. So it's 2 stories, but it's set to the rear behind a 2-story house. It's inset. It uses a different material. It kind of, is similar in design. It has a hipped roof like the original house, but it's also clearly identified as new due to the change in material. So no false sense of history. We have here a dormer addition. It's set back from the facade. It's not majorly impacting any historic features. The original chimneys have been maintained. And the bow window beneath is maintained. Then we have here a rooftop addition, but it's set back from the facade. You only really see it if you're looking at it from an angle. The original facade of the building, the main form of the building is maintained, and that addition is set back. Versus additions that would not meet the standards, pop tops that significantly change the massing and height and demolish, destroy original features such as the original roof form, additions that go straight up on commercial buildings and aren't set back and kind of change the whole massing. A side addition that kind of looks like it's swallowing the original property. Another one, a bungalow here on the lower right that has so many additions that it's hard to really keep track. And some examples here, kind of how to do successful and unsuccessful. So both of these are public buildings with elevator additions. But on the left there, you see the Phillips County Courthouse. They added their elevator addition at the rear. It's simple in design. You don't see it at all from the front. Slight change in materials. You can tell it's modern, but it really just blends in. It's very simple. Versus another one that is put right on the facade in the middle of the building, large 2-story tower that really significantly alters the appearance of the historic building. So again, another examples of additions that do not meet the standards. So on the left, you have one that's really too replicative. Again, that creating a false sense of history. The new addition is both very large, so it doesn't really, fit the scale of the original. It's larger than the original property, but it is also so replicative that it's really hard to distinguish from the original property. So that can also be considered to create a false sense of history. Then on the right, you have a very modern addition. It's to the rear, so that's great, but it doesn't really relate. You don't see that relationship between the original structure and the large addition. And then finally, standard number 10. So make new additions reversible. So standard 10 says, new addition shall be done in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So make it possible that you could remove it. If it's going to be an addition that's of its own time, it's what we're going to do now, but don't destroy the real historic fabric. So here we have a rear addition that's all glassy and great and really minimally connected to the historic building. So great, you could easily remove that glass addition and would have minimal impact. You also see a large rear addition, but kind of minimally attached at the rear. So that is also one that could be easily reversed. Another good example in Denver is the rear addition to Cuba. So rear addition for additional seating space for the restaurant, but really minimally attached to the historic building. And so that's an addition that could easily be removed in the future and it's not having a significant impact on the original historic structure. Okay, so thank you for joining me for that brief tour of the Secretary of the Interior standards. Happy to take questions if anyone has questions, and just also want to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars. So in May for Historic Preservation Month, we're going to do a series on architectural styles. So 3 parts there as we do a tour of architectural styles. And then in June, we're going to have one on researching and writing historic designations coming up.